as usual, it's probably starting right now, but I'm going to wait until the Facebook gives me the green light. Okay, we are live now. We've probably been live for the past 5 seconds, but hello, I'm Josh.
And I'm Kelly.
And together we make up Uprooted Faith, which is this online Facebook group, YouTube channel that you're watching us from right now, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, where we tackle a variety of religious, Christian, food questions, once a week.
Food is a stretch. Food, mostly Peeps and
other, I can't remember else.
Snack foods.
Yeah. So welcome for joining us live. Appreciate it. If you're joining us after a live, thanks for watching as well. And maybe sometime you can join us during a live stream on our Facebook group channel. We don't go live on YouTube. We just upload the video afterwards. And we typically do Wednesdays at 6:30 if we're both here on time. And that's also a stretch for the most part. But we made it here on time tonight. So tonight, or today, we are going to kick off a 3-part series to discuss Paul and who is Paul. And we'll just go over some background tonight, and the next 2 episodes we'll cover some more details on some of the stuff. But I was doing some research, and I mean, if you look at the New Testament, he wrote, depending on who you believe, he wrote between 7 and 14 books. Or letters. Some letters you could argue were not written by him, but by someone in his voice or in his tone.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about, if you do the math, approximately 28% of the New Testament is written by Paul, potentially, allegedly, if you believe the letters were written by Paul. So he had some influence on the early churches that we'll get into, and I think he may be one of the more controversial figures in today's society, as people seem to take some of his verses out of context to use them for a variety of reasons. And we can unpack that at later episodes, but I wanted to start tonight just by unpacking who Paul was and what was the time that he lived in. But I guess before we get started, if you are watching us, maybe for a starting question, when you think of Paul, when you hear the name Paul, what do you think of? I know with my wife, she loves his conversion story, but she hates everything he talks about with women. It seems like he's against women, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've had a similar experience as starting off, and then as you've grown more and learned more, maybe you've changed your opinion of him. But
yes.
Okay.
I read a book many years ago called, I think it was called What Paul Really Said, or something like that.
Okay.
And that was really helpful to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's just get started. I guess let's start with Paul, I guess, the pre-Christian. And I don't know if you give us some background there. So he started as Saul, and did he have authority in the Jewish synagogue or priests or whatnot? Or
Well, he was a Pharisee.
He's a Pharisee, that's what I'm getting at. I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, he was a Pharisee. And he had a great zeal for God, religious devotion, like some of the characters in the Old Testament, like Elijah. Elijah killed prophets of Baal. And so I think Paul kind of saw himself in that light. I'm defending God here, and I am cutting out this like cancer that's growing on the Jewish body here. We got to get rid of that.
Being in the Christianity is where I thought that was. Okay.
The Jesus followers. It was a time of religious and political angst, unrest, and so I think that may have fueled it a bit, because we can't have Jews like going over here in this group and being, telling stuff that's not true about Judaism. And although in that time there's kind of like a Jewish umbrella of different groups, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Nazarenes, and then there was this Jesus follower or this Jesus movement. So it wasn't that, and I think this is really important for people to understand. Paul was a Jew and was always a Jew.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people, I mean, even Martin Luther, the great Reformation leader, he was very anti-Jew. And there have been a lot of Christians over the centuries who are anti-Jew, and they seem to forget that Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was never a Christian. That term Christian didn't come about until maybe mid first century. And I think Paul died maybe in 60 AD. He was kind of the same age as Jesus. They were born around the same time. But I don't know that he would have ever met Jesus.
That was my question. So he would have been around at the time of Jesus. I guess the Gospels never talk about him, but he would have known who Jesus was. He may have...
Probably. It just depends on his exposure to him. You know, where was he living? In Tarsus? Was he living in Jerusalem?
Okay.
You know, I don't really know, but yeah, the whole thing about anti-Semitism that people seem to take out of Paul's letters is so misguided, and it's just not true.
Okay.
He was proud to be a Jew.
Yeah.
He was proud of his heritage.
I think he was also, what helped him later on in his ministry was that he was a Jew, but he also had Roman citizenship. And that was rare at the time to have both of those things.
Yeah.
So he sort of has feet in both camps to allow him to move around. So he persecuted Christians. I think the famous one was with Stephen, right?
Yeah.
And he was the one that stood and watched over the clothes of the people that were stoning him, right?
Yeah.
So he was a pretty, I guess we'll say, evil person at that time. I guess.
Well, I mean, in his eyes, he thought he was righteous.
Yeah.
You know, because he was having zeal for God and defending God's honor. So in his mind at that time, you know, he was doing the right thing.
And I assume with, you know, the Bible focuses on Paul, but I assume there are other Jewish Pharisees that were doing similar things to Paul, to Christians as well, right? Or was he the main guy?
I don't know. I'm sure. Yeah, there probably were other
people persecuting Christians.
Other high-ranking religious folk who were, you know, and I think he had, I don't know, permission or whatever from whoever.
Yeah.
You know, yes, get out there and get them.
By whatever means necessary, right? So he goes through that, and then he has we'll say a life-changing moment where he's blinded by the light, right?
Mm-hmm. That's where that song comes from. Blinded by... No, sorry. No. Yes, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Well, who are you?" And it's like, it's Jesus. Stop persecuting me. And then he was blind. And he had to be led into town, and then God told, was Ananias?
I think so. Yeah.
You know, you got to go see Saul, and Saul was his Hebrew name because he was from the tribe of Benjamin, just like King Saul.
Okay.
So he may have been named for King Saul, but that was his Jewish name, and Paul was a Roman name.
Okay.
So we don't know why he changed, or they started calling him something different. I don't know. So Ananias was sent to go see Paul, and Ananias said, "Excuse me? Are you not aware of what this dude's been doing?" And so he went, and then like the scales fell from his eyes, and he just, that was all it took for him to be converted. And wouldn't it be enough for all of us to meet Jesus and hear Jesus speak to you? And
you would hope
that'd be enough to move you. But it wasn't just his conversion, it was also his call, because Jesus said, you're going to bring the gospel, the good news, to Gentiles. Mm-hmm. So it was a conversion story. It's also a call story.
Okay. And then from there, he went on to do ministry. I think I have some numbers here where it says he approximately visited about 100 or more cities and regions throughout his ministry to minister to the various churches and to the Gentiles and whatnot. They're estimating that he traveled around 10,000 miles on his various missionary journeys. I think he went on, I think he went on 2 different missionary journeys around Mediterranean. So he went around a lot, and then I think from the churches, he continued to communicate with them through the letters, and some of those letters made it into the New Testament. So I guess, and those letters are really what has driven some of the controversy, because if, again, as we talked about in previous episodes, is that the problem we have is we tend to read the Bible in today's mindset, today's context, as opposed to the context back then. And there are, controversial topics that mainly come out. Like I said, my wife has issues with some of his verses or some of his views on women in leadership. There's also some big, he has views on, potentially against homosexuality, right? And there's other views that come across, other controversial topics like slavery or anti-Semitism, and people tend to use his verses, we'll say, out of context. And I think I've joked around before that he must be tired from rolling in his grave so much because of everybody misquoting his stuff. And I guess in future episodes, the next 2 weeks, next week we'll unpack either his views on women, what do you really mean by women, and the following week we'll probably unpack his views on homosexuality, what do you really mean by that. But I guess one thing I found interesting is that they attribute about 13 or 14 letters to him in the New Testament, but I'm not sure if there's proof to show that he wrote all of those, right? There are maybe some letters that other people may have written in his tone and maybe used his name as a...
Maybe. Of course, we don't know.
Yeah.
Scholars speculate, and they have different reasons for believing he did write them or he didn't write them. If I wrote something and copied someone's style and said it was written by them, that would be plagiarism today. But at that time, it wasn't. It wasn't considered bad. In fact, it could be considered as complimentary.
Okay.
So it's possible that some of the letters weren't written by Paul. I'm not sure that he physically wrote any of them. He did have, I think he had scribes who would write for him. I mean, he was blind at one time, and he talks about that affliction that God never took away, and some think, well, maybe that had to do with his eyes, and so maybe he couldn't see well enough to write.
Okay.
But so people could have copied his style, and but some people don't agree with that, and it doesn't nullify what's in those letters, because it could be that someone who traveled with him and knew him very well and knew what his theology was wrote in his name. It could be. So the other thing to consider is that these letters were personal. He was writing to certain groups of people and addressing particular things. And so you can tell from his letters that people had written to him, and sometimes messengers would come with questions or reports or whatever, and he would write back his answers.
Okay.
So sometimes we have to think, was this meant for the people at that time?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this for people of all time? You know? So we kind of get into some of that with the issues with women and homosexuality.
Sure.
And also in the context of that time was that Rome had colonized Jerusalem, and Rome had control over all these places where Jews lived, and they wanted to, the Jewish people wanted out from under that. And so there was, like I said, a lot of political unrest, and but loyalty to Caesar and Rome was expected, and it was rewarded. And so when Christians did not do that, then that's where the persecution comes in. But Paul, like Jesus, warned the people that it was useless to revolt. A lot of Jesus' teaching has to do with that, because the people were, becoming agitated and agitating others, and, we're going to rise up against them. And Jesus kept saying, that's not going to work. Don't do that. You're just going to ruin yourselves. So a lot of those verses of Jesus where we think he's talking about sending people to hell, he's really talking about, that's a terrible idea to go to war against Rome, because you're not gonna win. You're gonna lose your life. And he predicted the fall of the temple, which did happen. So at the same time, Paul was saying, this isn't the way to do things. Revolution is not going to get you what you want. And he also didn't want people to disobey the government, because he didn't want, like criminality to be associated with the gospel. So the gospel was more important. So that's why he wrote things like, obey the government, or live at peace with your neighbors as much as possible, because that was the way that Jesus taught. That was the way to pass the gospel on, was just to live it, and to not try to fight evil with evil.
Sure.
So some people take that out of context and say, well, Paul's saying we have to obey the government no matter who they are. And that's not, he wasn't saying the government's always right. He was saying, we can't have this, we can't do this political unrest thing and still preach a gospel of love. So
one thing I guess I always struggle with Paul's letters is he occasionally comes off as a braggart. He likes to brag about, hey, I have suffered more than all of you. My faith is stronger, and it comes across, I'm better than all of you because I've suffered all this, right? And I feel like that's more of, as I've read more into it, it seems like he's trying to justify why these churches, which are still in their infancy, should be, listening to him over people that are coming into the church to try to maybe break it apart, right, in a way.
Yeah, and I suppose some of that is hyperbole or rhetoric, that because he was very well educated, and so he almost like argued cases like a lawyer, but he was, because he was the apostle to the Gentiles. So he was dealing with people who were not Jewish, who did not have that Jewish background. But some of the Jesus followers who were Jewish would come into these Gentile churches and tell them, no, you got to get circumcised and you got to do it this way. And Paul was like, no, they don't. And he and Peter actually clashed about that one. And then Peter came around to his viewpoint. So he's like, look, if they're telling you that they are, they are wonderful Jews, and and have this heritage, and they have all the answers. He's like, look, I was a Pharisee.
Yeah.
I think I know what I'm talking about here. And
yeah.
And a lot of his letters were some of his letters were to encourage or to correct, because they were all still trying to figure out how to be a church.
Yeah.
And but he laid out his theology in these letters, and sometimes it just feels like it's going over my head.
Yeah.
Because it's so dense. And I can only imagine what it was like to be a Jesus follower, and to not have that Jewish heritage to look back on, because like the disciples, their minds were open to the scriptures, and so like they connected all the dots about Jesus and the prophets and the Torah and all that, and it all made sense, because the scripture is an overarching story. It's a complete story, God's story, and Jesus was there from the beginning, and so they get that. Well, if you don't have that background and you're just coming, to find out about Jesus and and his gospel, his good news about love and forgiveness, grace, mercy, then you're still trying to figure out what is this all about. And so so Paul explains a lot of that in his letters. He talks to the people understanding that they don't have this Jewish background. Mm-hmm. But he also says something really important about being grafted into, that Israel is the true vine, and we are just, Gentiles are grafted in, so we are being adopted into the family. And, he's saying, yes, some of the Jews have, rejected Jesus, but they still are the ones who hold the truth, who, worship the one true God. And, and Gentiles, don't think you're any better than the ones who have rejected Jesus, because you are just grafted in. And I think that's important, for people who want to use Paul to support their anti-Semitism, because that's just not there.
Yeah. What do you think are some guidelines if we fully want to maybe understand Paul and his letters? I mean, would you have some recommendations on how best to approach reading those letters? Because I'd see if someone is, new in their faith, or maybe they're coming back trying to rebuild their faith. Mm-hmm. I could see the letters of Paul being a struggle for some of the things he says. Are there some recommendations for how best to approach those?
Well, it's always a good idea to study scripture with other people.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you learn things from each other, so that's always a good idea. There's so much written about Paul. I went on YouTube, and I looked up something specific about Paul, and there's all these videos. I will say that N.T. Wright is a really good source, because he's studied Paul. He's written books about Paul. He's written commentaries on Paul's letters. So I would recommend anything from N.T. Wright, although I disagree with him on his views of homosexuality. Okay. So, but he knows a lot about Paul.
Okay.
So.
Well, that's interesting. I think also, as I mentioned before, he comes across as maybe a little loud, outspoken, and bragging most of the time. And I struggled with that in the past. And what's interesting is, at least in my viewpoint, with what's going on today in the world with this rise of Christian nationalism that sort of seems to be coming in and sort of pushing its way into Christianity and challenging the viewpoints and potentially trying to, in a way, tear down Christianity. I feel like, that's probably part of what was going on at the time, but it was more of a struggle we need to, get through this infancy and get to a more mature Christianity. But, I can fully understand people need to be more outspoken, more bragging now against this Christian national movement, right? We need more Pauls in the world, educated, we'll say, well-known to push and challenge and say, no, this isn't right?
And, I would say, I don't think of Paul as a braggart. I think of Paul as very zealous.
Okay, that's fair. That's a better way of putting it.
Zealous to dismantle the Jesus followers, then he became just as zealous for Christ.
Yeah.
And so, but I agree with your point that we have to know, if as Christians we want to speak out against Christian nationalism, we have to know what we're talking about, and we have to be strong about that. And I think it's not as hard as it sounds, because I think if you just go back and read the red words in your New Testament,
yeah,
that's all you need, But also, Paul, talked about some of these things too, where, he emphasized these things that Jesus said, and, and kind of clarified them and worked out the theology of them, not by himself. He had the other apostles and other people that he studied with, and but he was very articulate and able to, to pass those on to churches.
Sure. Okay.
But yes, I think that as Christians who believe that Christian nationalism has nothing to do with Christianity, we do need to stand up against it, because it's very much rooted in racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Paul would grind his teeth if he knew any of his words were being used to support that. So yeah, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of Christian nationalism.
We won't. We'll say that for another. We'll say that for another topic. Yeah, I know. Yes. I didn't mean to say that for another day. So hopefully, it gives you some good background on Paul and the society or the times he was living in. Next week, we'll unpack. We'll go into more detail about specific verses and letters about women and women leadership. Because at the surface, you could say, well, Paul was against women in leadership roles. He was against women. He just didn't like women at all, right? But I think as you dig in deeper, if you dig in deeper, you'll find that maybe it's not as, he wasn't as horrible as maybe his letters depict.
Well, and right? I'll say one thing about that.
Go for it.
If Paul was so against women speaking in church or being in leadership, why did he have at least 10 women that he lists in his letters as co-workers?
Good point. So we'll unpack that next episode, and then the third episode we'll do some more digging into homosexuality. I think that one is a bigger hit because people do use those verses to justify anti-LGBTQIA plus communities. So that also, we'll dig into that. And on the surface, it seems like he's against that, but as you dig into it, there's more behind that story. So thank you for watching us tonight. We'll be back again next week to unpack more of Paul. Thanks, Kelly, for giving us this background.
Of course. That's what I'm here for.
And we'll talk to you later. Have a good day.